We're going to be moving on now to a slightly different set of sessions, starting with now a session that will deal with the strong headwinds we're facing in the AMR space, but also the solutions that are being implemented. And session 7 is economic incentives. And for that session, I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator, Dr. Catherine Payne, who's Professor of Health Economics at the University of Manchester, UK, also a member of the JPIAMR Scientific Advisory Board and a member of the Scientific Steering Committee for this workshop. So Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. We've had some really interesting talks up to now, as you can see, mainly focusing on development strategies for new approaches to the treatment of infection. As Mark has already alluded to, this session is a little bit different, and we will start to focus on the need for generating economic evidence and thinking about the incentives for producing new therapeutic strategies, and specifically thinking about appropriate pricing and reimbursement models. So we have a really interesting panel. We have 4 people speaking, each been allocated 10 minutes. In terms of what we've asked them to focus on, we've asked them to think about showcasing some different models of economic incentives for the development of antimicrobials, thinking about some of the pros and cons of each of these different approaches, and really thinking about where we're going forward, you know, what are the sort of future research activities that we should be thinking about, and most importantly, coming at this from different perspectives, so providing a view from academia, from industry, and from policy. So I will hand over to our first speaker on my list, which is Mark Sculfer, who's Professor of Health Economics at the Centre for Health Economics at the University of York. So thank you, Mark. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Just share my screen, if you can see that. So I'm going to talk about the UK antibiotic reimbursement model, but give particular focus to the implications for assessing value. The bottom line here is that however we fund new antibiotics, health systems have to understand how much they're worth. And that is no easy task. And the methods we use in other areas, frankly, are too limited when we apply them to antibiotics. So just to indicate that much what I'm talking about relates to work that's funded by the National Institute for Health Research Policy Research Programme through the Policy Research Unit, EPRU. I have no other conflicts of interest to note. So the UK model, the reimbursement model I've referred to, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that. I'm not planning to talk in great detail about it. Essentially, it involves the NHS paying for access, but not by volume. The so-called Netflix model is such that payment is paid for periodically over time, and that takes away, but the delinking with volumes means that for particular new antibiotics to be put on the shelf and made available as a last resort in the context of serious resistance issues does not penalize the manufacturer and developer, who can still rely on an income stream from that type of use. And so that delinked payment scheme raises a whole series of questions that research that we've been involved with is trying to answer. So what level of payments should be made? How do we determine the value that in turn determines those payments? What evidence is used for that? how is that evidence and payment reviewed over time, and how long does the arrangement last? So in 2018, we undertook this piece of work, which was looking at how the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, in this country, might review the value of new antimicrobials under this delinked funding arrangement. And in particular, how NICE's methods of value assessment or health technology assessment might need to be modified. And that work is now at a really rather critical stage, because we are about 4 months into a 1-year project, which is undertaking 2 test evaluations for Kefavi and Cefidracol, 2 particular antibiotics, and we are assessing the value of those antibiotics in a UK NHS context, and we are providing that information to a committee that NICE has developed, who will deliberate on the evidence, establish a position about value quantified in health terms, and that in turn will guide the NHS in their discussions with the relevant manufacturers about those payment levels under the delinked scheme. Now, there's a lot of detail here, but in the time available, what I'm going to try and talk about are the key principles about value assessment. What we're trying to establish is a set of potential health impacts. So the most obvious are the direct health impacts of these new products being available on those patients who receive the drugs. So they're the direct health impacts. But we need to take into consideration that how those products are used and how other products are used as well will potentially change resistance patterns over time, with impacts on other patients' health. They may also affect transmission of bacteria, which also will have indirect health consequences on other patients, as well as those directly affected by these products. And any cost savings associated with these drugs as well can have health implications, because that allows other types of expenditure in the health system. Now, we can think about that at the current time, but we have to think about that over time, over a very long time horizon, not just the lifetime of the directly impacted patients, but well into the future. And so the total value of these particular products relates to the long-term gains in population health associated with having them available. But that broad framework begs a series of questions. So how are these products going to be used? In what indications and in which settings? And in particular, we distinguish the microbiologically driven or determined settings. So when we have genetic information about not only the pathogen, but the mechanism of resistance that might be relevant, versus a more empirical setting. How do we determine a payment level that reflects something about the rate at which the NHS can generate health elsewhere? So remember, in taking funding away, making funding available under this delinked scheme is taking funding away from other uses of healthcare, which generate health. We have to understand something about those opportunity costs. We need also to think about patent length. The time horizon for these value assessments is way longer than the expected patent length for these products. How is that considered when payment levels are determined? And as I'll show in a minute, the uncertainty associated with the evidence in this area is significant. At the point at which these initial funding decisions are made, we will have considerable uncertainty about that long-term impact on population health. The question is, how is that factored into decision making about payments? We face a whole series of evidential challenges in this work. The regulatory trials that we generally rely on when we're doing value assessments of new drugs are by their nature much less valuable in the context of new antibiotics because of the way those trials are designed, generally as non-inferiority studies in settings where multi-drug resistance does not exist. The licenses for these products are very broad, but for the purpose of value assessment and informing NHS payment decisions, we need to understand those indications and settings where these products have particularly high value. We need to think about the health of individuals that are treated with these products versus wider implications for population health, because there are some marked trade-offs. In particular, if we use new antibiotics in a more empirical setting, then that might have greater immediate benefits for the patients treated, but due to the mechanisms of resistance that might impact, but there may be negative implications for other patients into the future. And trying to quantify those trade-offs is extremely challenging. We need to think about the multitude of settings and comparators, existing treatments for these new antibiotics. And we have to think about whether actually the availability of new antibiotics will have any impact on transmission, any marked impact on transmission. And if so, we need to think about how we quantify that. So ultimately, given those evidential challenges, uncertainty about value is inevitable. And so a key element of our work is to think about what that means for payments. So a payment that reflects total value is not necessarily appropriate if that estimate of total value is itself highly uncertain. We also need to recognize that in principle, mainly through surveillance, evidence will emerge as these products are used. And so the flexibility, a level of flexibility in determining how these payments might change over time is an important thing to consider. So in summary, there are a whole series of policy challenges relating to how to incentivize the development of new antimicrobials. We know very little about how much of the share of value between the health of populations and the proportion of value that goes to developers of products, how much of that share going to those developers is necessary to create the right incentives. Any policy around payment, whether that's based on volumes or delinked from volumes, requires health systems to understand something about the value of that product to the system. And the methods we have available currently that we use in cancer and heart disease and lung disease are frankly not fit for purpose. The methods that we are beginning to use are in development, but we have to recognize that there is going to be considerable evidential uncertainty about value when initial decisions about funding levels are taken. And handling that uncertainty and considering reviews over time is critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Fascinating talk. So the plan is that we listen to all the presentations first, and then we have 20 minutes at the end for sort of a question session. Can I encourage everyone to use the chat function to register any questions that they may have for the panelists? Thank you. So next up we have Jenny Hellman. Jenny acts as an analyst at the Public Health Agency of Sweden. I'll hand you over to Jenny now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks JPIAMR to inviting me. As we all here know, the market is not working anymore. We have availability problems globally. How the solution should look like, we don't know, but what we do know is that we need to act and we need to think new. And I'm the project leader for the Swedish pilot study of a new reimbursement model regarding keeping new critical antibiotics available at the Swedish market. So the model is a kind of de-linked model, partially the linking volume of sales. The aim is to keep or to bring new critical antibiotics to the Swedish market. And before I go into principle for the model, I will give a very short background. Sweden still has a favorable position when it comes to antibiotic resistance. Antibiotics are used in a restrictive way compared to many other countries, and Sweden is a small market. Consequently, some products face very low demand that there is a risk that pharmaceutical companies do not choose to have them available on the Swedish market. So in June 2018, the Public Health Agency got a government commission to perform a pilot study of a new reimbursement model. We prepared the principles for the model during 2 prior commissions from the government in 2014 and 2017. So the work on the new reimbursement model have been ongoing and prioritized at the Public Health Agency and by the Swedish government for many years. The pilot study involves testing of contracting processes and legal aspects. And we shall also, of course, evaluate effects on availability, as well as evaluate the cost benefits of the model. The goal is that we, in the end of 2022, shall give the government a recommendation on if and in what way this model could be extended in Sweden or implemented in Sweden. One important aspect with our commission is that the model do not focus on incentives for research and development. It is focusing on availability. So now I will go into principle for this new reimbursement model that we are piloting. So the first question is, what antibiotics? How to select antibiotics? Well, we at the Public Health Agency have developed an algorithm to identify products for the reimbursement model, which is antibiotics of special medical value with risk of availability problems. The algorithm includes several evaluation steps. First, we identify antibiotics with low sales and few market authorization holders. Secondly, we evaluate antibiotics for activity against high-identified high-risk resistance type, ecological profile, and role in Swedish treatment guidelines. This in order to define the specific medical value. Finally, we categorize the identified products for different kind of models. And now I will shortly go through the principles for the reimbursement model. And as I said in the introduction, it's a kind of de-linked model, partially de-linking volume of sales. The first principles is that a minimum annual revenue are guaranteed from the national level to the pharmaceutical company. In return, the company delivers certain amounts in specified time limits. For example, the company should be able to deliver products within 24 hours to hospitals. In Sweden, we have decentralized healthcare system. And in the model, the healthcare will continue to pay for the products and for the use as usual. And the reason for that principle is that we don't want to influence the prescriber's choice of antibiotics by giving the product in the model some economical advantage. Third, we are doing annual reconciliations. If the company's income from sales is lower than the guarantee level, as we expected, the differences will be paid up from national level. If the revenue of companies from regions is higher than guarantee level, The companies will keep the income from sales, and we will pay up 10% extra. And that's the volume of the security stock as a compensation for the security stock. So now, how to set the guaranteed annual revenue? This has been hard discussions, a lot of discussions, but the principles to set the guaranteed annual revenue in the pilot has been estimated as price per package multiplied with the security stock, which is based on current and projected need over the contract years. And finally, to compensate for administrative overheads and the requirements to ensure availability with a specified delivery timeframe, we are scaling this up by a factor of 1.5. Now to the antibiotics for the pilot study. The antibiotics has been identified by the working model and identified by independent experts. For the pilot, we will start with one area, which also comply with the WHO defined critical hygiene pathogen, area number 1. We had an open tendering for the pilot study in May to June 2020, and the goal was to get contract with all antibiotics that fulfilled our requirements. The results from the tender is that we now have contract with 5 products. All products that applied fulfilled the requirements. There were actually one more product that qualified for the tender, but the company decided not to apply. We are very happy with this result. 3 are new to the Swedish market. To sum up with a few lessons learned, it has been a learning process to go from theory to practice. It has given us so many insights. And I would like to say that it has been more complicated than expected. It is a complex context. We have both national and EU laws. And to be able to implement a new reimbursement model, there are many legal aspects and also practical and organization aspects to set and to decide. We have constructed the model according to the Procurement Act and current structure and laws for drug ordering, payment, and delivery. It has been important for us to not influence prescriber's choice of antibiotics or build any parallel structure for antibiotics in this model. It was quick to get products in stock after agreements, and that's of course very good. The pilot study is a moving target, so it's good to have resources and plans for evaluation and monitoring from the start. Continuous evaluation and monitoring helped to adjust the principles as good as possible during the project. Before we opened the tender, we had dialogue with pharmaceutical companies and regions in line with the Procurement Act. And I think the dialogue helped us a lot. It gave us input from different perspectives, like public health, healthcare, and industry perspective. Some challenges for the future. How to choose the antibiotics for the model. The principle must be evaluated and perhaps changed according to resistance level and medical needs. Also, the level of annual guarantee income. I think the level will differ over time, and we are now evaluating the principle for the pilot. So let's see after the pilot study. And last challenge, who will finance this? For the pilot study, it's the Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Agency. And last, a few aspects for the future. More pilot studies are needed. There is no silver bullet. The Swedish pilot is just one alternative new model for availability. It can probably be adapted to other countries, but it must need to be adjusted regarding laws, regulation bodies, organizations, and medical needs, of course. We also need more pilots because we have different categories of antibiotics. We have new and old antibiotics, antibiotics for outpatient care and for hospital care. I think collaboration and experience sharing is important Perhaps establishment of an international network for sharing experience would be good. And our model is an addition to incentives for research and development and mechanisms to secure the fragile supply chains. And we need to explore and work on all these 3 areas. And of course, political commitment is very essential and have helped us a lot in the Swedish work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jenny. That's fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Richard Gold. Richard is a James McGill Professor at McGill University's Faculty of Law and Faculty of Medicine. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining us. I'll hand over the floor to you now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. I'm going to be talking about a little bit more upstream from the previous 2 speakers. How do we actually generate the innovation, the new drugs that we need? And what we've noticed, of course, is that not only have large pharmaceutical companies moved out of developing new antibiotic resistant drugs or drugs for that, but also startups. So 2 startups recently went belly up, even though they had a product in line. And the problem is not restricted to AMR. There are other areas within life sciences that have similar problems in terms of getting the right incentives to help companies develop new drugs. Other areas include pandemic preparedness, getting drugs prepared in advance of a pandemic. Rare diseases where, for a variety of different ailments, including the division of cancers into smaller and smaller components, and pediatric diseases. In all of these areas, the market fails to provide adequate incentives to bring a product forward. The reasons differ about how the market is failing. So for AMR and pandemic preparedness, we know that there are going to be markets for it. We just don't know when. And the problem is that risk of when will the drug become or be needed means that the incentive structures we have today are insufficient. For rare diseases and pediatric diseases, it's the scale. The markets are small. In addition, AMR has a particular problem. So Essaran and Galini, 2 Canadian economists, noted that we want incentives not only to develop drugs to deal with antibiotic resistance, but we want the right kinds of drugs. So if we have too large a monopoly, for example, it might stop others from entering the field. And so we'll be overly reliant on one drug, just accelerating the time that it no longer functions. So the incentive structures also determine what kind of drugs we develop. Nevertheless, all of these areas face this common problem that the current incentive system simply doesn't work to generate the drugs that we want and that we will need. This sits within a larger problem where drug development overall is hitting certain barriers. And these are that the cost of developing a new drug is increasing, and not only increasing exponentially, whether you measure it by the number of people involved or the money thrown at it. At the same time, the productivity per unit, per drug, that is the life, quality life years generated, is decreasing per drug. So we have more costs to generate less benefit. One of the results of this is that firms are moving away from risk. Because of the high cost and low generation of benefits, they just leave the field, and AMR is a perfect example of that. And there's plenty of evidence of declining risk-taking, not only here, but in other areas. I'm going to talk about 3 barriers to developing drugs that lead to this productivity problem, this cost problem. The first is something that we can not do much about. It's just the increasing complexity of science. The easy stuff was found, and now we need more diverse teams, we need better equipment, and so the complexity of science is driving up the cost of doing any science. Second is misaligned incentives, and this is happening both in the private sector and the public sector. It happens a lot at universities where a lot of emphasis and increasingly is put on patents, which, as I'll talk about, are not a particularly good mechanism to transfer knowledge. And third is simply the balkanization, that we have a lot of different organizations, firms and universities doing their own research and not necessarily sharing the results, whether of clinical studies or even the ability to access first-in-class drugs to come up with alternatives. All of these models, the model we're using is suffering, and we need to supplement it with something else. So it's not necessarily getting rid of the system we have, but it is failing to deliver what we need. And we need to think about different ways of thickening the market, if you wish, providing more avenues to support innovation in this field. But we don't have to just imagine a world of new innovation incentives. We actually have some examples. I'm going to talk about one that stretches between Canada and Europe and around the world, in fact, and that is the Structural Genomics Consortium, which has a large campus at Oxford in the UK, but also in Canada and Toronto and elsewhere, in Sweden at the Karolinska Institute, Germany, and so on. They pioneered a new model which I call open science partnerships. And it's based on certain characteristics. The first is it involves radical sharing of knowledge. All data, all outputs, all materials, and all tools are made freely available, either at cost or actually for free. But anybody who wants to access them can access them. The second is within the consortium, there is no restrictive intellectual property. So no patents that would prevent other people from using the knowledge. This ensures freedom to operate not only for consortium members, but for others who may be looking in. And then the third is they've developed novel mechanisms to translate or transfer this knowledge into products and services with incentives in place for the private sector to move forward. These partnerships are generally multi-sectorial, public, private, philanthropy, and government, and that helps address the complexity. We have big firms, small firms, everybody with different skill sets and come together. That makes it easier for us to address all the complexity that science throws up. It also, by combining different incentives, academic incentives of being published, getting research grants, getting prizes, with private sector incentives of profit, with philanthropic incentives of meeting their goal, government incentives in terms of driving down costs and making sure that the medical system can cope with whatever is thrown at it. All of these mixed incentives help fix whatever lacunae might exist in the others. I'm going to return to the one issue in particular, and that's patents at the university level. These have proven to not be effective in terms of translating knowledge to the private sector, particularly in these areas of market failure. So there are obviously some wins. We can point to drugs that would not have been on the market but for patents, or at least we think that that's the case. But there are also a lot of drugs that never get anywhere because of patents, because people don't have access to the knowledge, because a lot of effort is put into patenting and keeping things secret, because we can't build partnerships quickly. One of the particular effects is that patents slow down these groups from working together. The thing that you hear most from industry is negotiating with a university about IP slows down startup of a project by 6 months or longer, and it also has effects on the back end. So you can lose 2 years simply because of the existence of IP. What the SGC has done is created spin-offs that don't rely on patents, but on regulatory data protection. This allows radical sharing, but still provides an incentive. I'm happy to get into that if in the questions. Just to give you an example of this within the AMR field, in Canada, we've set up VIMI, which is a Virus Interruption Medicines Initiative. And if you're Canadian, you'll know that the name VIMI has other meanings as well. And its aim is to create a pan-Canadian open science network for drug discovery in 4 areas of market failure, of which AMR, pandemics, rare diseases, and pediatric diseases are the 4 areas. The partners include universities, big pharma, smaller biotech, artificial intelligence firms in the drug field, philanthropies, including international ones such as MSF, international organizations, and so on. The goal is to develop first-in-class drugs in order to de-risk an entire field. So if we together, without patents, can create a first-in-class drug, that means other firms can jump in and competitive spirit will take over to generate even more drugs, perhaps better drugs. So the bottom line is we're not going to solve these problems that AMR presents without rethinking some of the incentive structures and the way we work together. So how do we reach this goal? Well, there are a few things that governments in particular can do. First, both governments and philanthropies can target money, so their research grants at open science partnerships. So have specific funds available to collaborations that are multi-sectorial but agree not to patent, to radically share all outputs, including materials, and agree to work together without, as I said, patents. Second, we can have targeted funding by philanthropy and governments that sit on top of existing research grants to make data available. Data doesn't want to be free. It costs a lot of money for someone to sit down and upload it. We need mechanisms and funding to enable that to happen. In Europe, obviously, there's the European Open Science Cloud. That type of infrastructure also is of great benefit. Another thing that we're looking at in Canada is altering the regulation. So when you file for a drug and get approval to sell that drug for a period of time, it varies from 5 years in the United States to 10 years in Europe, you are the only ones who can rely on that data to sell the similar product. We've approached the Canadian government and they're looking at it to extend by 4 years this protection if the sponsoring firm agrees not to patent, to radically share, and to agree to some level of price controls. So there's a variety of instruments available to governments and philanthropies to provide these type of incentives. It doesn't stop anyone from using the traditional patent mechanism. It sits beside it as an alternative that firms can consider. But if we don't start thinking early on and only worry about prices later, we're not going to get the drugs that we need. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Richard. Really a lot of food for thought there. Very interesting. Thank you. So I am going to welcome our 4th speaker now, Brian Dean. Brian is the director of the New Medicines and Data Policy Initiative at the Association for the British Pharmaceutical Industry. Thank you very much, Brian. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me and the opportunity to say a few words, and I'll touch on both the global position and the UK position. By way of a bit of an introduction, clearly the global challenge remains. We're aiming to create the environment for a sustainable development pipeline for new antibiotics, primarily to combat the multi-resistant pathogens, the priority pathogens. In my many years in the industry, we've tended to think that our pipelines are built on estimates of unmet need, and that's by patient, but also according to patient numbers and our ability or our predicted ability to show significant clinical benefit. And so in this area, quite clearly going back to the sort of high level background situation, by the 1990s, we had a lot of antibiotics, very little unmet need, and a diminishing chance of adding value. And I think the activity since 2013, where UK was very much part of the forefront of describing the potential public health risk that Lord O'Neill quantified in his report talks to some of the challenges that Mark talked about, and about uncertainty, because we're trying to value the prevention of a future problem rather than valuing what's in front of us at the moment. I think the UK remains amongst the leaders here. We are obviously, as you've heard, testing a new subscription type payment model, and I'll come back to that in a little while, and that is part of the second 5-year national plan. If I just go on to describe the discovery, development and delivery process, there are obviously a variety of incentives. We think we're fairly well served at the push end of the funding of new research, and we've heard during the conference about new mechanisms, new approaches, which is great to hear. Traditionally, we thought that bacteria are fairly simple things, and there weren't that many mechanisms for antibiotics to work, and there weren't many mechanisms for resistance to be developed, but there's a lot more going on now, which is great. We have recently heard about the AMR Action Fund, where at least 24 companies have pooled some money to help bridge this gap from that discovery of new candidates through to towards regulatory approval. And clearly there are other pieces where we might get some sort of incentives to pull through. So these range from accelerated approvals on the regulatory front to one-off market entry rewards that O'Neill described, to transferable exclusivity extensions, which seem to be a bit complicated but have been discussed in some detail at a European level, through to these novel reimbursement models. We've been closely involved in discussions that have led up to the UK subscription model being tested, and we are at a critical point now. We do believe that this testing of 2 products, where we're right in the middle now, as Mark has described, of the evaluation process going on, we do believe that that can demonstrate the principle that payment models separated from volume usage can work. I think there's also a piece where the usage of this needs to be stewarded very carefully. The approach to stewardship of and to ensure that we realize the value that has been described in the valuation and that is reflected in the payment model needs to be monitored quite carefully. And I think the Jenny described some of the practicalities of that in the Swedish effort. So it is a critical time in the UK pilot. So just to maybe to finish up and stimulate some discussion here, these types of payment models have got 3 key components to my mind. The first is that we value a new antibiotic on preventing that AMR public health challenge. It's not just about the relatively low number of multi-resistant pathogens that we encounter at the moment. It's looking at preventing that future risk. The second is that these are based on agreed annual payments separated from volume usage, and that they're used then under a stewardship plan so that the uses in patients who need them, we preserve their utility, minimize the development of resistance in these new agents. And so just to finish up, clearly, as we've said time and time again, no one country can solve this. We do believe the UK pilot and the AMR action plan add significantly to the landscape, but the global challenge still remains. The environment is still not there yet for a sustainable development pipeline for future antibiotic needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. So we've heard from all our 4 speakers now, and we have if my watch is correct, we have 15 minutes spare for a question and answer session, and some nice questions have come through. I will pose them in the answer that they've come through on the chat function. The first question comes from Renee Coppens. I think it was directed at Mark because it came in during his presentation. So the question is, what critical barriers currently exist to roll out such reimbursement models on a larger scale, including a broader portfolio of new antibiotics? And by larger scale, I think Renee says they mean across the European Union, with a collaborative model between all member states within that union. I don't know if you had any thoughts, Mark.
Yeah, well, I take that question to mean collaboration and rollout in what we would call the value assessment or health technology assessment. And there's a real challenge there to start with, because we don't start from the same place. There's considerable international variation in how value is assessed. And I think in countries that tend to do less of that quantitatively, I'm thinking particularly Germany, for example, France to a certain degree, I think it's really difficult to extend the methods to the complexities associated with new antibiotics. And you know, I think to really make progress in this area, we're going to have to form a common view about how we quantify the value of any pharmaceutical. But we also have to recognize that, you know, on the whole, most of the markets we're talking about, in Europe at least, are small markets. And the extent to which anything we do incentivizes anything on the pull side, on the health system payment and value assessment side, is inevitably limited. So we, I guess, need to see progress in the US in particular around how they assess and implement value, again, across medical technologies.
Thank you. Brian's just indicated, do you want to respond, Brian?
Just a comment that on that point about the US, I think it's very useful that the language in the Pasteur Act that was put before Parliament in September is very similar to the language we've been using today in terms of separating payment from volume usage and that sort of thing.
Thank you. So Jenny, there was a question for you in the chat, and I think you've already answered it, but I'd like to share it with everyone who's listening in. So from Anne Nungan, does the health insurance participation of citizens have an effect on the determination of the revenue sold package? You gave a very comprehensive answer in the chat, Jenny. Can you sort of summarize what you suggested?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, in the pilot, we are now evaluating the annual, the set level that we have in the pilot. And I think, I mean, this is just the first suggestion. And we are, the principle for that is that we, the price is the average price for the included products, and it's based on what the hospitals is paying in Sweden. So yeah, I mean, we have a principle that we now are evaluating, and I think we are very much and very interested following the UK pilot as well, trying to find new ways of see the value of antibiotics, of course. But I think it's important to start pilots already and try to do pilot studies of different models. It could help.
I think Brian's got a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, just similarly, I think I agree. We've got to try these things out. I think one of the discussions we've had with the groups in the UK is when we get to actually on the ground is making sure that the unit pack price that we may need to have the thing move through the system neither incentivizes nor de-incentivizes the use in the right patients.
Thank you. So I've got a question for Richard now from Freya Harrison. And Freya would like you to detail, Richard, if you can, what data protection is in the absence of a patent. So what does that actually involve? Can you just give a little bit more detail on that?
Sure. And thank you, Freya, for the question. There are multiple different regimes, right, that apply to pharmaceuticals. So one is the patent system, and I'll put that aside. It is what you apply for when you have a drug, but usually before you've taken many steps along towards clinical trials. So you get it early on before you actually prove the drug is going to work, and there's a lot of failure after that. Once you've taken a drug through clinical trials, so all the preclinical work, all the clinical trials, which are the most expensive component of drug development, you file a dossier with the various health authorities, and it will depend on the particular jurisdiction who you go to. And that dossier helps convince the regulator that the drug is safe and efficacious. And at the end of that, hopefully you get approval to sell the drug. Now, the data you provided, all that preclinical data, is sitting with the regulator. So let's say I put on I sell drug X and I get market approval for it. A competitor comes along and says, well, drug X is really good. I'm going to manufacture it and sell it. The health regulator will say, okay, where's your data? And they say, well, you already have the data. The health regulator will say, no, I'm not allowed to look at it for a period of time. In the United States, that's 5 years for simple drugs, 12 years for biologics. In Canada, it's 6 to 8. In Europe, it's 10 years, but it varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But the end result is they would have to replicate all of that very expensive to create data in order to sell it. Most people won't. A generic company won't do that. It's just not worth it. The difference is that patents start when I've first discovered the drug, before I've done most of these trials. Data protection starts in the date of approval. It takes about 12, 13 years between the time I patent and I get market approval, and then it lasts for 8 years plus whatever supplementary period, up to 5 years, I can get. This approval is automatic and happens at that 12-year mark. So it will extend to about 22 years, 23 years after discovery. The other difference is about, in the United States, 43 to 46% of patents that are challenged in court are ruled invalid. You can't rule this invalid. It is foolproof. The other thing is, as a drug company, I have to pay to sue someone for infringement. For regulatory protection, the government does it for me. So if I'm a small company relying on data protection, it is a really strong form of protection. So we don't usually consider this intellectual property, but it does the same thing. And so there are some companies that only rely on data protection, but many companies rely on both.
Thank you, Richard. That was really helpful and comprehensive. I have a question here from Kevin Outerson, who's not directed it to anyone, so I'm going to pick on you, Brian, to answer this, if that's okay. Kevin suggests we should all welcome collaborative efforts in AMR R&D, but what do we know about the efficiency of such efforts in the clinical phases? Will the attrition rates be different? We should not assume that universities or open access consortia will have the same attrition and productivity. So I know that perhaps talks to Richard's presentation a bit, but I'm just be interested what you think about that question, Brian.
And I think COVID's highlighted that we need more collaboration in these areas that are difficult. So I mean, that in the first instance, I would say that that's very important. I think it's already been alluded to as well. I think, Mark, you talked about non-inferiority trials, which are pretty unhelpful when you're looking at the small number of multi-resistant pathogens. And I think there's a case for combining that trial collaboration with looking at a more conditional approval based more on microbiological efficacy hopes, with then a very careful stewardship monitoring plan that would then look at actual functioning in when those priority pathogens crop up. But that's quite a complicated and long-term ambition that I might have. I think attrition rates are attrition rates. I don't think you know, anyone can short circuit the fact that you might get it wrong sometimes.
Thank you, Richard. Do you have anything to add from your perspective? No. Okay. Okay, we've got 3 more questions here. The next one is directed at Mark from, it's a comment really, Mark, from Rosemary Dorrington. So Rosemary comments that if we've learned anything from the COVID pandemic, it is that access to vaccines and drugs is inherently still unequal. But in many ways, the economic value of new drugs may be even higher in developing economies with less resilient economies and workforces. So I suppose if I wanted to turn that into a question is, yeah, do you think there are sort of specific challenges when we look perhaps at some of the low middle income countries? Yeah, thoughts?
Indeed, but I think they are common challenges to those relating to other pharmaceuticals and medical technologies. And what we have to get in place is a credible system of price differentiation, whereby the affordability of new products is reflected in their price, their acquisition price within those systems. Clearly, all the same issues around stewardship, around incentivizing clinical behavior are just as relevant, more so probably in low and middle income countries. But the issue of access can only be addressed through understanding that pharmaceutical developers and manufacturers have to allow prices to vary with affordability, and there are well-established ways to do that. So ultimately, I think that's the key route, but no different here than it is across other therapeutic areas.
Thank you. So I have 2 more questions here. I'm going to take them out of order. First one I'm going to direct at Richard, who this is from James Mason, who said, you know, he likes everything you said. They said, that sounds great. But says, but for universities, we don't have the means to get drugs to approval and have to publish our research. Is there a solution that would help us?
Yes, the regulatory system actually helps you. First of all, it allows free publication. So there are ways to make the data accessible, freely accessible to everyone, while still getting protection under these regulatory schemes. So that one does not preclude the other, and the SGC has set up a spin-off, the Agora Open Science Trust. It's a charity that owns a bunch of for-profit companies that rely on this. And they publish everything, including their quarterly strategy meetings. So there's no contradiction between open publishing and reliance on this. It's limiting people to use the same data for regulatory purposes. The sponsor controls the data. The second thing is we do in universities some research that goes into it. Some preclinical research is often done at universities, and so there is a level of protection. But really the protection comes from working in a consortium, which can take the drug forward. And the cumulative work of the consortium can bring the drug, let's say, to phase 1, and then you hand it off. So this is the strategy at the Agora Open Science trust. They take it to phase 1 trials. They sell the regulatory package to a pharmaceutical company that then does the rest and then applies. So the initial company has the rights in the initial research. The pharmaceutical company to whom you hand it off has the rights afterwards. So it actually works very well for the university, and the SGC is mostly university based, and they've been using this for quite a while.
Thank you. This last question I think is quite tricky to answer, so I'm going to let people volunteer to answer it. So it's from Nicholas Harrison. And the question is, how might the data underlying the evidence that's used to assess the value of antibiotics differ among nations? Are there opportunities to streamline evidence development that benefit multiple countries? Would anybody like to have a go at that? Well, Mark's going in there. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to have a go. I mean, this is our very challenge at the moment with the NICE test evaluations. Some evidence can reasonably be assumed to generalize across settings, and perhaps the treatment effects, relative treatment effects of antibiotics might be one for a given pathogen resistance mechanism. But others, like the epidemiology of those pathogens and mechanisms of resistance, are very particular to setting, not even, not just between countries, but within countries. But the frameworks for evaluation can be shared and can be streamlined. But we have to recognize we're always going to need the best available local evidence to make better decisions.
Thank you. That was a very interesting session on my part. I've written down about 10 questions myself, which obviously I didn't have a chance to ask, but thank you all for excellent talks. I'll hand you back to Mark now. I'll explain where we're going next. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for this excellent session around economic incentives. Thank you very much, and see you then.